The Alpha King ordered, "You will carry my child." The rejected Omega was left speechless. Mist wound through the streets like restless spirits, curling around the ankles of those who dared to tread there after dusk. It was a kingdom ruled by strength, by blood, and by the whispers of legends older than the tallest towers. And within it lived a girl named Elara, an Omega unlike any other. Elara had always known she did not belong. Even as a child, people had looked at her with quiet suspicion, their eyes tracing the faint markings on her wrists and the peculiar, unspoken aura that seemed to follow her. She was soft-spoken, careful with her words, yet in her heart burned a defiance no chains could hold. She had learned to move through the world as an observer, never drawing attention, never challenging the fates that cast her aside. But fate, as it often did, had a way of catching up with those who tried to hide. The great hall of Castle Vera was vast, its ceilings lost in shadow, its walls adorned with banners of 1,000 years. Torches flickered along the corridors, casting light that trembled like living things. On the dais, the Alpha King Darius sat upon his throne, a man whose very presence seemed to bend the air around him. His eyes, dark and calculating, scanned the room as if he could pierce the hearts of all who entered. He was a king who demanded obedience, feared by many, and yet there was a certain magnetism that drew even the most wary closer. Elara entered the hall cautiously, her heart beating in a rhythm that betrayed both fear and curiosity. She had been summoned without explanation, a summons that no one in the kingdom could refuse. Every step she took echoed on the stone floors, the sound swallowed almost immediately by the immense silence that greeted her. "Stand," the king commanded, his voice deep and commanding. It resonated through the hall like the tolling of a bell. Elara obeyed, feeling the weight of every gaze upon her. Even the courtiers, usually cold and indifferent, watched with barely restrained curiosity. "Do you know why you are here?" Darius asked, though his tone carried no real question. He expected no answer. Elara lifted her eyes slowly, meeting his gaze for the first time. There was power in him, undeniable and overwhelming, yet beneath it, there was a shadow she could not name. I do not, Your Majesty," she said carefully, her voice soft but steady. Darius leaned forward, his fingers resting lightly on the arm of the throne. "The prophecy speaks of an Omega who will bear the child of the Alpha King. That child will bring balance or ruin to Eldoria. You, Elara, are that Omega." The words fell like ice. Elara's breath caught, and her hands trembled ever so slightly. She had heard whispers of the prophecy since childhood, stories told in fearful tones, but she had never imagined she would be drawn into it so directly, summoned to the very throne to fulfill it. I cannot," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I do not." "You will," Darius interrupted, his tone flat, almost casual in its authority, yet beneath it lingered an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "The kingdom requires it. I require it. Your will does not matter." Elara's mind raced. Her life had been one of quiet defiance, of small freedoms carved in shadow. She had survived by knowing when to speak and when to be silent. And now she was confronted with a force stronger than any she had ever faced. Fear, indignation, and a strange, reluctant fascination churned inside her. "I am not yours to command," she said finally, her voice firmer than she had expected. "I will not be used as a tool for prophecy or power." Darius's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger but in curiosity. No one had ever spoken to him like that before. He had ruled with dominance, yes, but he had never encountered resistance that intrigued rather than insulted him. "You misunderstand me," he said, rising from the throne. His presence filled the hall completely, the shadows around him seeming to deepen. "I do not ask, I order. You will carry my child, Elara. The kingdom's fate depends on it, so do your own." Elara's knees threatened to buckle. She had no answer, no words strong enough to resist a command of such weight. She felt the sting of helplessness, of being caught between fear and the flicker of a strange, unexplainable pull she felt toward the man before her. She turned abruptly, stepping back, and her hand brushed against the carved wooden railing of the dais. The touch grounded her, reminding her that she still had a choice, even if it felt impossible. Outside the hall, the corridors were silent, save for the distant echo of the king's voice still lingering in her mind. She wandered blindly, the mist from the open windows brushing against her cheeks like cold fingers. Her thoughts were a storm, anger at the audacity, fear of the unknown, and an impossible, undeniable curiosity about Darius himself. Why did he command so completely? Why did the mere thought of his presence make her heart pound? A shadow detached itself from the corridor wall. A figure moved with quiet grace, stopping just before her. "He desires more than obedience," the stranger whispered, a hand brushing her arm lightly. "He desires the truth your heart hides." Alara's breath caught. "I don't understand," she murmured, unsure whether to trust this mysterious figure. "Do not fear it," the figure said softly, "but beware. The path you are on will change everything, including yourself." And with that, the stranger slipped into the shadows, leaving her alone with the cold wind and the echo of words that burned brighter than any torch. That night she lay in her small, dimly lit room, staring at the ceiling beams as moonlight poured through the window. She tried to make sense of everything, tried to decide whether she should flee, confront, or accept the impossible. Yet sleep eluded her. Her mind was filled with visions of Darius, his piercing eyes, the strength in his posture, and the faint, almost imperceptible shadow of loneliness that lingered behind his formidable presence. Her thoughts returned again and again to the prophecy. Could it be true? Could a single child born of this union truly save or doom the kingdom? And what part of her heart was being pulled toward the man who demanded her obedience so utterly? The night deepened, and with it came a whisper of wind that seemed to speak to her, wrapping around her like a secret. A choice awaited, one she had not yet seen clearly, one that would shape not only her destiny but the destiny of Eldoria itself. At dawn, Elara found herself walking the castle gardens, mist curling around her ankles. The first rays of sunlight revealed roses blackened by frost, a reminder that beauty and danger often existed side by side. And in the midst of that garden, Darius appeared, as if drawn by the same unseen force that had drawn her to this moment. "Do you intend to resist me forever?" he asked, his voice quieter than it had been in the hall but no less commanding. "I do not know," she admitted, the truth trembling on her lips, "but I will not be ordered. I will not be taken." Darius stepped closer, the air between them charged with tension neither fully understood. "It is not about taking, Elara," he said softly. "It is about what must be done, and soon you will understand. But until then," his gaze softened just a fraction, revealing a hint of vulnerability beneath the kingly exterior. "You must choose whether to face it with courage or fear." Elara swallowed hard. The words resonated deep within her, awakening something she had tried to keep hidden, a longing for connection, for understanding, and perhaps even trust. And yet, the weight of the king's decree pressed heavily upon her, a shadow she could not escape. As the morning mist swirled around them, she realized that her life had changed forever. She could not turn back. And somewhere, deep in the recesses of her heart, a spark of curiosity, fear, and a strange, unwelcome fascination with Darius had begun to burn. And so the stage was set. A prophecy, a king, and an omega caught between fear, desire, and destiny. The kingdom held its breath, as did she, waiting for the first act of a story that would shape them all. In the silence of the misted garden, a voice whispered through the wind, carrying a promise and a warning. "The path you choose will not only decide your fate, but the fate of all Eldoria." Elara stood alone, yet not entirely, feeling the weight of the unseen eyes upon her. And somewhere in the depth of the castle, Darius watched too, his thoughts unreadable but his intent clear. A story had begun, a story of power, defiance, and an unspoken bond that neither could yet name. And the kingdom, shrouded in mist and shadows, waited. The mist still clung to the castle grounds, though the sun had climbed higher, scattering shadows across the stone paths. Alara moved cautiously through the royal gardens, her fingers brushing against the frost-kissed leaves. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if the air itself carried the weight of her fate. She could not shake the memory of Darius's eyes, sharp, commanding, and yet tinged with something she could not name. Since the king's decree, her mind had been in constant turmoil. She was no stranger to the world's harshness. Being an Omega had taught her vigilance. But the summons, the prophecy, and the weight of carrying the Alpha King's child were things she had never imagined facing. Fear, indignation, and something dangerous, something that felt like curiosity or fascination, twisted together in her chest. Alara knew she could not confront Darius alone. She had to understand the prophecy, the king, and herself. And so she began wandering the hidden corners of the castle, searching for secrets tucked into shadowed corridors or ancient libraries. The castle's library was vast, its shelves stretching to the vaulted ceiling. Dust lay thick over tomes that had not been touched for decades. Some held maps of forgotten lands, others chronicled battles long ended. And among the books, Alara sought the one that might reveal the truth about the prophecy, or at least offer a glimpse of what she had been pulled into. Hours passed, the sunlight dwindling as she traced her fingers along leather spines. One book, bound in deep crimson and etched with golden runes, called to her. She opened it carefully, the pages whispering as they turned. The writing was old, filled with cryptic symbols and half-remembered histories. And yet there it was, the story of a union that would determine the kingdom's fate. It was not a story of love or choice, she realized, but of necessity and power. An Alpha and an Omega, bound not by affection but by destiny. The child they produced would be more than an heir. It would be a vessel of balance or ruin. And the Omega, chosen by blood and by fate, had little say in the matter. Alara closed the book, her heart pounding. She had known the weight of destiny before, but this was unbearable. She was expected to surrender to a man she barely knew, to carry the future of Eldoria within her. The thought made her stomach churn, and yet a flicker of something else stirred within her, a defiance she had not felt before. She would not submit blindly, she promised herself, not without understanding. The next evening, Darius found her in the gardens again. He had come without announcement, moving through the mist with the silent grace of a predator. Yet when he saw her, his gaze softened ever so slightly, a flicker of curiosity and admiration crossing his features. "You seek answers," he said simply, as though he already knew. Alara looked up sharply. "And what if I do?" she asked, her voice steady despite the tension curling in her chest. "Then you will find them," he replied, stepping closer. "But know this, the answers you seek may bind you to a path you cannot leave." She met his eyes, and for a moment the distance between them seemed to vanish. The air grew charged, heavy with unsaid words and impossible emotions. Yet even as a strange warmth crept into her chest, her pride and fear held her back. "I do not belong in this story," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I will not be ordered, controlled, or used to fulfill some prophecy." Darius's expression hardened, not in anger but in thought. "You misunderstand. It is not about control, it is about survival. The kingdom will not endure without this union, and in time, perhaps, you will understand why it is necessary." Alara's hands clenched at her sides. "I will not surrender myself without understanding, Your Majesty. I will not be commanded into something I cannot choose." For a moment Darius said nothing. The wind stirred the frost-kissed leaves and the garden seemed to hold its breath. Then slowly he nodded. "Very well," he said. "You will not yield yet, but know this, time is not on your side." That night Alara lay awake in her chamber, the crimson book opened beside her. Her mind raced with thoughts of Darius, of the prophecy, and of the strange, magnetic pull she felt toward him. She had faced fear before, had fought against the expectations of others, but nothing had ever demanded so much of her heart and her courage. Days passed, each more difficult than the last. The castle felt like a labyrinth, with every corridor hiding whispers of the past, secrets of the king, and shadows of a destiny she could not yet embrace. The courtiers watched her, some with pity, some with curiosity, others with envy. And all the while, Darius observed her from afar, fascinated by her defiance. No one had ever resisted him with such fire. One evening, the threat of the supernatural stirred. Eldoria's lands were ancient, steeped in magic that was older than any living soul. Dark forces had lingered in the forests, feeding on fear and weakness. Rumors spoke of a spirit that haunted the royal line, one that thrived on chaos and despair. And now those whispers had grown louder, reaching even the ears of the king. Alara was in the library when the first signs appeared, a tremor through the stone floors, a cold draft that snaked through the room, and a whisper in the air that seemed to speak directly to her heart. The pages of the crimson book rustled as if moved by invisible hands. She felt a shiver run through her, not of fear but of recognition. Something was coming, something that would test her, Darius, and the fragile balance of Eldoria. Darius arrived shortly after, moving silently through the library's shadowed corridors. His presence filled the room as always, and yet now there was a tension between them, a dance of proximity and distance neither fully understood. "You feel it too," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, his eyes dark and intense. "It is the spirit of the old line. It has been restless for centuries, and now its senses change, it senses you." Alara's breath caught. "Me. You are part of the prophecy," he said, stepping closer. "And that means you are part of the threat and part of the solution." For the first time, Alara felt a flicker of understanding, and with it, a surge of fear and exhilaration. She had always known her life would be difficult, but never had she imagined it would be entwined so completely with the king, the kingdom, and forces beyond mortal comprehension. Over the following days, Darius sought her out again and again. Their encounters were tense and charged, each conversation a mixture of challenge and curiosity. He tested her patience, and she tested his restraint. And in the quiet moments when the castle was still, she caught glimpses of a man beneath the kingly armor, one shaped by loss, loneliness, and a longing he did not fully allow himself to feel. One evening, they found themselves alone in the moonlit gardens. The frost had begun to melt and the silver light bathed the leaves and petals in a soft glow. Darius stood close, yet not so close as to force her back. His voice was quieter than usual, almost confessional. "You resist me," he said. "Not out of fear, not entirely. You resist because you understand what is at stake and you are strong enough to demand truth." Alara swallowed hard. She wanted to speak, to tell him of the confusion, the fear, and the strange pull in her heart, but the words lodged in her throat. "You are not like others," he continued. "Most would have obeyed, most would have submitted, but you are different. That difference may save us all or destroy us." Alara felt a tremor of something she had never allowed herself to name, curiosity, attraction, and perhaps something deeper. Yet she forced herself to step back. "I will not be forced, Darius. Not by prophecy, not by fear, not by anyone." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "No, you will not, and that is why you may be the only one who can save this kingdom." As the moonlight faded and the night deepened, the air between them remained charged. Neither spoke again, but both felt the unspoken acknowledgement of a bond forming, a bond neither could yet define, but one that would shape the days to come. And in the shadows of the castle, the ancient spirit stirred. It had sensed the tension, the fear, and the unspoken connection. Its eyes glimmered unseen, feeding on the uncertainty and the hope, knowing that the coming days would demand choices no one could avoid. Alara returned to her chamber that night, the crimson book open before her. She traced the faded runes with her fingers, feeling the pulse of the magic beneath the words. Her heart ached with the weight of her destiny, yet a quiet resolve settled within her. She would not surrender blindly. She would not be a pawn. She would face whatever was coming with courage, with defiance, and perhaps with an understanding of a man who was more than just a king. And somewhere, deep in the castle, Darius stood at the balcony, watching the first stars of the night appear. He thought of her, her defiance, her fire, her fear, and her curiosity, and he knew that the path ahead would demand more from both of them than they could yet imagine. A storm was coming, both in the world outside and in the hearts of those who would shape Eldoria's future. And in that storm, they would either find salvation or be consumed by it. The forests beyond Castle Vera had always been a place of whispers. Trees older than memory loomed over tangled paths, their branches reaching like fingers into the mist. Even the courtiers avoided these woods, claiming spirits lingered among the roots, watching, waiting. But Alara now walked among them, her cloak pulled tightly around her shoulders, the crimson book tucked under her arm. She had left the safety of the castle not to escape Darius, but to understand the truth behind the prophecy. The warnings of the mysterious figure from the hall haunted her still. The path you are on will change everything, including yourself. The forest was quiet at first, deceptively so. Each step she took was swallowed by the fog, her heartbeat echoing through the silence. She felt a strange energy in the air, a pulse beneath the earth that seemed to guide her. Her omega senses tingled, telling her that she was not alone. "Why do you come here?" a voice said suddenly, low and steady. Alara froze. Darius stepped from behind a great oak, his presence somehow even more commanding in the forest than in the hall. His eyes scanned the surroundings but always returned to her. "This place is dangerous," he said, "even for one like you." "I came for answers," Alara said, her voice firm despite the chill in the air. "If the prophecy is real, I need to understand it for myself. I cannot just obey blindly." Darius's gaze softened, though he did not lower his guard. "And yet you are drawn here," he said. "There is something in this forest that calls to you, something even I cannot control. That is why we must face it together." She looked at him, the tension between them taut like a drawn bow. They had spent days in close proximity, their conversations a mixture of challenge and revelation. And yet the forest demanded something different, a cooperation beyond words, a shared courage neither had expected. The mist thickened, curling around their ankles like living tendrils. Ahead, the path split, shadowed and uncertain. And from the gloom, a whisper came, soft at first, then louder, carrying a weight that pressed against their minds. "Who's there?" Alara demanded, gripping the book tightly. A figure materialized from the fog. It was not human, yet it carried a strange familiarity, an echo of the past, a shadow of the royal line. Its eyes glowed like embers, and the air around it thrummed with power. "I am the spirit of the old line," it said, its voice both many and one, like wind through the trees. "I have watched your ancestors, kings and queens alike, for centuries, and now the prophecy brings you here, Omega." Alara stepped forward, her chest tight with fear and determination. "What do you want from me?" "Balance," the spirit said, "or destruction. You will decide which path the kingdom takes. But know this, the child you carry is not merely a symbol. It is a vessel of power, and its strength will shape the fate of all who live here." Darius moved beside her, protective yet tense. "And you, spirit, do you seek to harm us?" The spirit's form shimmered, almost amused. "Harm, perhaps, but only if you are unworthy, only if your hearts are divided by doubt and fear. Face the truth within yourselves and you may survive. Fail and Eldoria will fall." The words struck Alara harder than she expected. The prophecy was no longer abstract, no longer whispers in the castle corridors. It was alive, tangible, and watching her. And yet, as fear surged, so did a strange confidence. She had spent her life hiding, shrinking, surviving. Now she felt the spark of courage she had never allowed herself to embrace. Darius studied her, sensing the change. "You feel it, don't you?" he asked softly. "The power in you, it is growing." She nodded, unsure whether to fear or embrace it. "I can feel it. But I don't know how to control it." "You will," he said, "and I will help you, but you must trust me." The words were simple yet heavy. Trust had never been easy for Alara. She had been rejected, feared, and isolated all her life. But Darius, he was different. Not merely because he was a king, but because he had shown a glimpse of something vulnerable beneath the armor of his authority. Together, they moved deeper into the forest, following the whispers of the spirit. The path narrowed and the mist thickened until they could barely see their own hands. Every step carried danger, every shadow seemed alive, and yet the presence of each other steadied them. Hours passed. Exhaustion threatened, but the forest demanded they press on. And then in a small clearing they saw it, a pool of black water, still and impossibly deep. The spirit hovered above it, its glow reflecting in the rippling surface. "Step carefully," it warned. "The water will show you your hearts. Only by confronting your truth can you survive." Alara swallowed hard, looking at Darius. "What do you mean, our hearts?" "You will see," he said, his hand brushing against hers, a fleeting touch that sent a shiver through her. "And we must face it together." The surface of the water shimmered, and suddenly they were no longer in the forest. Shadows of their pasts rose from the depths. Alara saw herself as a child, hiding in corners, rejected by those who feared her. She saw every moment of doubt, every fear, every whispered insult. And beside those images she saw Darius, alone in the throne room, burdened by the expectations of a kingdom, haunted by losses no one knew, forced into a mask of strength while yearning for connection. Her breath caught. This is too much," she whispered. Darius took a step closer, his presence grounding her. "No," he said, "it is necessary. To face ourselves is the only way to grow. Only then can we protect what we care for." And so they faced the visions together. Alara confronted the shadows of her own fear, her rejection, her loneliness. And Darius, for the first time, he allowed himself to feel, to acknowledge the pain of a life built on duty and isolation. When they stepped back from the pool, the mist had begun to clear. The spirit hovered between them, glowing softly. "You have seen yourselves," it said. "Now you must see each other. Only by understanding each other can you hope to survive the darkness to come." Alara turned to Darius. I understand a little more now. I see why you are the way you are. But do you understand me?" His gaze softened, and for the first time the hardness of the king was gone, replaced by something human. "I see your courage," he said, "your defiance, your fear, and your strength. It frightens me in a way I cannot explain, but it also makes me trust that together we can face what is coming." A silence settled between them, heavy with unspoken words. And then the spirit spoke one final time. "You will be tested not just by power but by heart. Protect each other or all will be lost." The forest around them began to shift. The mist receded, revealing a path back to the castle, but the journey had changed them. Neither could deny the bond forming between them, a bond of trust, respect, and something deeper, more fragile and more urgent than either could yet name. As they returned, the sky above Eldoria darkened. Clouds gathered, swirling with an unnatural energy. The wind carried whispers of unrest, of power yet to be unleashed. And in the castle the courtiers sensed it too. Something was stirring, something that would not wait. In her chamber that night, Alara sat by the window, the crimson book open again. She traced the runes, feeling the magic pulse beneath her fingers. And though fear still lingered, there was also a spark, hope, courage, and an understanding of the man who had, for the first time, seen her as more than an omega, more than a tool for prophecy. Darius watched from the balcony, his eyes fixed on the stars that were now partially hidden by gathering clouds. He thought of Alara, her fire, her courage, her defiance, and he knew that the coming days would test them both in ways neither could yet imagine. The storm that gathered over Eldoria was more than just rain and wind. It was the echo of ancient power awakening, the manifestation of prophecies, and the stirrings of the spirit that had haunted the royal line. And as the first drops fell, Alara and Darius felt the weight of their bond, fragile yet unbreakable, and the knowledge that only together could they face what was to come. Somewhere, in the depth of the castle and the forest beyond, the spirit watched. And it waited, knowing that the trials ahead would demand every ounce of courage, every spark of trust, and every shred of heart from both the Omega and the Alpha King. For Eldoria's fate was not yet sealed. But the path forward was dangerous, uncertain, and charged with a power that would test love, loyalty, and the very essence of courage itself. The storm that had been brewing over Eldoria finally broke. Thunder shook the stone walls of Castle Vera, and lightning split the sky, illuminating the darkened forests like a sudden revelation. Rain poured down, washing over the castle grounds, and yet inside a different kind of storm was rising, one of fear, courage, and impossible choices. Alara stood at the edge of the balcony, her cloak clinging to her from the relentless rain. Her hair was wet, strands plastered to her face, but she barely noticed. Her thoughts were fixed on what awaited them. The forest had spoken, the spirit had warned, and the weight of the prophecy pressed on her heart. She knew that today would decide not just her future, but the fate of the entire kingdom. "Are you ready?" Darius's voice came from behind her, calm but heavy with purpose. He was drenched as well, but his posture was unwavering, his eyes dark with the same fire that had first drawn her attention. He stepped closer, and for a moment the storm seemed to fade into the background, leaving only the two of them and the impossible task before them. Alara turned to him. I think so," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "but it feels like everything is against us." Darius placed a hand lightly on her shoulder, a touch that sent a jolt through her chest. "Perhaps," he admitted. "But the storm outside is nothing compared to the one within. Today we face both, and together we may survive." The path to the forest was treacherous. Fallen branches, mud, and sudden gashes of lightning forced them to move with caution. Yet as they walked, a strange calm settled over Alara. She had faced visions of herself, confronted the weight of the prophecy, and glimpsed the hidden layers of Darius's heart. She was no longer the same Omega who had arrived at the castle months ago. She had grown stronger, more certain of her own power, and more aware of the bond forming between her and the king. They reached the clearing where the black pool had waited, its surface now churned by the storm. The spirit hovered above it, more vivid and imposing than before. Its eyes glimmered like molten gold, and its voice rang out, echoing through the trees. "You have come," it said, "as the prophecy demanded. Now you will face the trial." Alara swallowed hard. "What trial?" she whispered. The spirit gestured to the pool. "The darkness that threatens Eldoria is not merely in the forests, nor in the enemies that walk the land. It is in fear, in doubt, in the unwilling hearts of those who claim power. You must face it, both of you, and only together can you prevail." Darius took her hand, gripping it with a strength that steadied her. "We face it together," he said, his voice steady, filled with unspoken reassurance. The water began to swirl violently, and the reflection of their own faces dissolved into shadowed forms, twisted, monstrous, and dark. Shapes rose from the depths, embodiments of every fear and failure they had ever known. For Alara, it was the rejection, the whispers, the loneliness that had haunted her entire life. For Darius, it was the weight of kingship, the isolation, the harshness that had made him a ruler feared by many but loved by few. The shadows lunged at them, but neither hesitated. Alara drew on the courage she had cultivated, feeling the pulse of magic that had always been a part of her bloodline. Darius met her side, his strength complementing hers, forming a protective shield around them. "Together," he called, and they stepped forward into the swirling darkness. The trial tested every part of them. Fear threatened to consume them, doubt whispered lies in their ears, and the weight of the prophecy pressed like chains around their hearts. Yet with each step they found a rhythm together. Darius's presence grounded Alara, while her courage and insight softened the sharp edges of his control. Where she faltered, he steadied. Where he wavered, she inspired. The shadows shifted, forming visions of what could be, failure, ruin, and despair, but also glimpses of what might be, hope, unity, and a future shaped by trust. Alara realized that the prophecy had never been about obedience alone. It was about choice, about the courage to face darkness without surrendering to it. Finally, at the center of the pool, a figure emerged, not a shadow, but a manifestation of the prophecy itself. It was neither fully human nor fully spirit, but a being of light and shadow intertwined, the embodiment of the kingdom's fate. Its eyes met theirs, and a voice spoke directly into their hearts. "Your choices will determine everything. Fear may tempt you, but trust and courage will prevail. Will you face the darkness, not as king and Omega, but as two hearts bound by understanding?" Alara met Darius's gaze. There was no fear there, only a shared determination, a recognition of the bond that had formed between them. "Yes," she said firmly, "together we face it." Darius nodded, his hand gripping hers tightly. "Together," he echoed. They stepped into the swirling light of the pool, and the shadows recoiled. The being of prophecy tested them, pushing them to confront not just fear, but pride, doubt, and the temptation to turn away. But with each challenge, their bond grew stronger. Alara's courage fused with Darius's strength, and the darkness began to crack, light breaking through the cracks like the first dawn after a long night. The final test came when the being of prophecy split their path, one side showing Darius as a ruler unyielding, feared and alone, the other showing Alara as an Omega forced to submit, her spirit broken. They each hesitated, the temptation to flee their fate strong. But they turned to each other, finding in the other's eyes the courage to continue. "We are not alone," Darius said softly, his hand brushing hers. "Whatever comes, we face it together." Alara nodded. "Together," she repeated, feeling a surge of strength she had never known. With that, they stepped forward into the center, and the shadows dissolved entirely. The being of prophecy shimmered, then dissolved into light that washed over the clearing, illuminating every corner of the forest. The storm outside began to calm, the first rays of sunlight breaking through the clouds. Alara felt a warmth in her chest, a bond she could not name but would recognize anywhere. Darius stood beside her, no longer merely a king, but a man who had chosen to trust, to hope, and to embrace the unknown with courage. "You have passed the trial," the voice of the spirit echoed faintly as it disappeared into the air. "The kingdom will endure, and your hearts are stronger for it. The choice was never obedience alone, but understanding, trust, and the courage to love." Alara turned to Darius, her eyes reflecting the sunlight now breaking through the mist. We did it," she whispered, still in disbelief at the magnitude of what they had faced. Darius smiled, a genuine, soft expression that few had ever seen. "Yes," he said, "together we did." The return to the castle felt lighter, almost surreal. The storm had passed, leaving a refreshed world behind. Courtiers and guards whispered of the strange calm that had settled over the land, of the clouds that had cleared as if by magic, though none could understand why. In the days that followed, the prophecy became clearer. It was not merely about bloodlines or the birth of a child. It was about the courage to face one's fears, to trust in another, and to build a future not dictated solely by destiny but by choice. Alara and Darius both transformed. She was no longer a timid, rejected Omega, but a woman of strength, insight, and resilience. And he was no longer a distant, commanding king, but a man capable of empathy, vulnerability, and connection. The kingdom began to heal, as did their hearts. Where fear and distrust had once ruled, hope and understanding now took root. And in the quiet moments, when the world seemed still, Alara and Darius would meet in the gardens or the libraries, speaking softly, their bond growing deeper with each shared glance, each moment of mutual respect and unspoken affection. On a quiet morning, they stood together on the castle balcony, watching the sun rise over Eldoria. The forests glowed with renewed life, rivers sparkled in the morning light, and the people of the kingdom carried themselves with a subtle, renewed courage. Alara leaned slightly against Darius, feeling the warmth of his presence. "We've changed," she said quietly, more to herself than to him. Darius's hand brushed hers, a simple touch filled with meaning. "Yes," he said, "but change is not the end, it is the beginning. We have faced darkness together, and now we build something stronger, something lasting." Alara smiled, feeling the weight of the past lift from her shoulders. "Then let's make it a future worth remembering," she said. Darius nodded, and for a moment the world seemed perfect, still, bright, and full of possibility. The storm had passed, the prophecy fulfilled not by obedience alone, but by courage, trust, and the quiet strength of hearts that had dared to understand each other. And somewhere beyond the castle walls, the forest whispered, carrying the story of the Omega and the Alpha King, a story of fear faced, courage found, and a bond that would shape Eldoria for generations to come. The kingdom held its breath, not in fear but in awe. And Alara and Darius, standing together, knew that no matter what storms might come, they would face them side by side. For the darkness had tested them. The prophecy had demanded truth. And in the end, love, trust, and courage had prevailed.